So as I was saying, I must start by expressing my deep gratitude and appreciation for Matthew's availability, for being here despite the time difference. It's already quite late in Australia, so we do appreciate your effort and are very, very glad to be able to count on your participation here nevertheless. So thank you so much. Matthew Sharpe is Professor of Philosophy at Deakin University. He completed his PhD in Philosophy and Social Theory at University of Melbourne and his Master's in Policy Studies at University of Tasmania. He's the author of 6 books, including Camus' Philosophe, to Return to Our Beginnings, published by Brill in 2015, and more recently with Michael Ure, he co-authored this outstanding Philosophy as a Way of Life, History, Dimensions, Directions, which I'm sure will soon become a reference to all those working on Hadot and Philosophy as a Way of Life. The book has just been published this year by Bloomsbury. He has also translated with Federico Testa a collection of essays by Hadot, which have never been published before in the English language. This collection of essays is entitled Selected Writings, Philosophy as Practice, published by Bloomsbury in 2020. And he's also co-editor of the Bloomsbury book series, Reinventing Philosophy as a Way of Life, and also of the new Brill series, Philosophy as a Way of Life, Texts and Studies. Besides all these, he has co-edited 10 volumes and journal editions and is the author of numerous articles in leading ranked journals and book chapters on philosophy, social and critical theory, and of course also on philosophy as a way of life, and even some quite specifically related to the topic of our symposium, from which I, as always, have learned a lot. So Matthew, thank you a lot for all your work on the field, for your participation here, and I really look forward to listening to your talk, which is entitled Between Self and Cosmos, the Other, on the Care for the Other, again, Between Self and Cosmos, the Other, on Care for the Other in Pierre Hadot's and Michel Foucault's conception of Hellenistic-Roman philosophy. So Matthew has sent us a PowerPoint which we can share. I don't know.
I already shared it through the chat, Marta.
Okay, so, but maybe Matthew, I don't know if you are comfortable with it, but maybe we would follow it better if you would share your screen as you speak, as you wish. Because of this virtual world, if we multiplicate the tabs, it might become more complicated. So thank you.
Sure. Okay, thank you so much for that introduction. Let me just confirm momentarily once this opens that people can see that. Can people see the slides?
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so my paper is it's sort of about 4,000 words, so it's probably about 40 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'll sort of skip over the introduction so we can get to the meat of it. Really, as the title suggests, I wanted to investigate in this paper, given that the focus that in part comes from Hadot on the cosmic dimension and its presence or absence in Foucault and his reading of the ancient texts. I wanted to explore another issue, which is the question of the other and relations to the other. And in Hadot's closing reflections in his piece, which Michael Chase translated, Reflections on the Idea of the Cultivation of Self, Foucault doesn't just talk of the difference between his own work and that of Foucault in terms of this cosmic dimension or identification with the whole, but he also talks about an effort to live according to justice in the service of the human community, something which he claims is not perhaps treated as adequately as it might be in Foucault's work. That's his claim on the basis of the history of sexuality work that was available to him. So I want to really just sort of assess that criticism, really explore that criticism, and do so by looking at the hermeneutics of the subject, which wasn't available to Hadot, only the summary of the course. And so what I'll be doing, as you can see with the enumerated, I guess, sections there, is first of all examining Foucault's claims. In particular, I want to focus on the contrast that he sets up between the Socratic Platonic care of the self, which I know was talked about yesterday. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be there. Of course, modeled on the Alcibiades Major. And it's he sets, Foucault, as people will know, sets this up in a kind of contrast with the Hellenistic and Roman philosophers, and I'll look at what he has to say about Epicurus, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius in particular. And then I'm going to move into a more critical, I guess, space, and I'm going to talk about Marcus Aurelius on the other, in particular by recourse to the Inner Citadel, Hadot's work as translated again by Michael Chase. And that will just set up some really brief closing remarks about maybe what this means. If the argument that I present in section 2 holds, which is that there's a great contrast in Foucault and Hadot at the level of their assessment of the relations to the other, in particular in Roman Stoicism, and in particular in the figure of Marcus Aurelius. So I'm going to try and track time, of course, because I do want to leave time for questions. So we're at about 9:10. So let's just see how we go. So Foucault's consideration of care of the self, as people will know, in the hermeneutics of the subject, really pivots on the reading of the Alcibiades Major. This presents what he calls the Socratic Platonic, or sometimes just Platonic model for care of the self. And I think it's in the context of this reading of the care of the self that the lecture series really develops. And so it's in the context of this model also that, of course, Foucault first engages with the question of what philosophical care of the self might mean in terms of relations to others. And he sets up, as you can see, I've tried to enumerate, and I think you can do that with Foucault because of the way that he thinks, a series of features that he identifies of this model. So firstly, as you can see, a primacy of the know yourself, which takes the form, of course, in Platonism of the doctrine of recollection, of the essences or ideas. Secondly, as the setting of the Alcibiades Major stages, this Platonic care of the self is principally and perhaps exclusively addressed to young adult men at the point of embarking on their political or public lives. And thirdly, the care of the self in the Alcibiades, as read by Foucault, as proffered, that is, by Socrates to the young Alcibiades, is tied to the exercise of power or the government of others. So, as you can see, Foucault writes, this dialogue involves showing Alcibiades that he had to take care of himself, both because he didn't know exactly what was good for the city-state, and on the other hand, in order to be able to govern the city-state and take care of his fellow citizens properly, he had to take care of himself, therefore, in order to be able to take care of others. So Foucault contends that throughout this text, care of the self is instrumental with regard to the care of others. And again, he sets things up very analytically. There is what he calls a functional or purposive relationship between Platonic care of the self and the government of others. So he says, I take care of myself so I can take care of others. Or again, speaking in the past tense, you cared about yourself because you have to take care of others. In addition, Foucault will stress that a kind of reciprocity between Platonic self-care and care for others applies. So he says, as a member of the city-state that a person rules, a young man rules, or a man rules, one saves oneself in so much as the city-state is saved through the good government of others. And finally, Foucault describes what he calls an essential complication of care of the self and being able to govern well in this Platonic conception from the Alcibiades Major. When one takes care of oneself here, one will come to recollect the very essences, hence essential, or ideas which, per the Republic, would enable a leader to institute justice in a city. And for these three reasons, the instrumental, functional, or purposive, the reciprocal, and the essential, Foucault contends that in Platonic philosophy, care of the self and care of the other are linked, as he says, in such a way as it is very difficult to separate them. So that's, I think, the background for the positioning of Hellenistic and Roman thought in a certain way. As the classical period passes into the Hellenistic and Roman eras, Foucault contends that one of the most important phenomena in the history of the practice of the self, and perhaps in the history of ancient culture, takes place. So that's a quote, he says. So as Foucault presents things, indeed, nearly everything about the Platonic model of the care of the self is altered in this cultural change. First, at the level of purpose, the self becomes the definitive and sole aim of the care of the self in the Hellenistic and Roman philosophies, possibly excepting the Neoplatonists, who I think have an interesting place in the text. The Platonic purpose of being able to govern others is no longer operative. So he says, under no circumstances can this activity, this practice of the care of the self, be seen as purely and simply preliminary and introductory to the care of others. One wishes to take care of oneself, to cure oneself, to lay claim to oneself, to enjoy oneself in new ways. This is the telos. Secondly, at the level of means, likewise, Hellenistic Roman self-care is an activity focused solely on the self, whose outcome, realization, and satisfaction in the strong sense of the word is found only in the self. That is to say, in the activity itself that is exercised on the self. So, of course, the question arises, given these statements, as to what place, if any, care of the others could play in this self-finalizing, as he describes it, Hellenistic Roman care of the self, which he presents in such stark contrast to the Socratic Platonic model. Foucault's, I think, somewhat uneasy answer, at least I think in the clearest formulation, is that in the Hellenistic and Roman philosophies, as you can see there, he says you should care about yourself, or about the self, because you are the self and simply for the self. And here's the important bit, I guess. The benefit for others, the salvation of others, or that way of being concerned about others that will make their salvation possible or help them in their own salvation, comes as a supplementary benefit of, or if you like, follows as what is no doubt a necessary, although only correlative effect of the care you must take of yourself, of your will and application to achieve your own salvation. The care of others is like a supplementary reward for the operation and activity of the salvation you exercise with perseverance on yourself. So, to try to get clear, because I think this is a difficult formulation, I believe what Foucault is proposing here is that care for the others is no longer, as in Platonism, the goal of caring for the self, at least for that small elite of young men ready to bid for power. Foucault's formulation here, in addition, suggests that care of the others is not even perhaps an essential part of care of the self, so much as a kind of externality, which may or may not be added whenever someone undertakes Epicurean or Stoic care of themselves. As Foucault explains of the Epicurean notion of friendship, which I think represents by far the strongest candidate to his kind of reading, quote, the Epicurean conception of friendship maintains to the end the principle that in friendship one seeks only oneself or one's own happiness. Friendship is just one of the forms given to the care of the self. And you see that friendship belongs entirely to the domain of the care of the self, and that it really is for the care of the self that we should have friends. Nevertheless, the critic will interpose. The Stoics disputed the Epicureans' hedonistic conception of the goal of life, instead prioritizing the virtues, including justice. Can we therefore really, per the hermeneutics of the subject, position Musonius Rufus's, Seneca's, Epictetus's, or Marcus Aurelius's conception of the relations between the I and the other as continuous with the conception of friendship in the Epicureans, viz. Their rival school? Does not such a positioning run the risk of papering over fundamental ethical disagreements, which were certainly clear to the protagonists themselves? Foucault makes his case by recourse, first of all, in Epictetus, to the Stoic doctrines, which might seem to make such a positioning most difficult, namely those of oikiosis and of the providential bond between creatures whereby, as he writes, by the same act and without wishing to or seeking to, each creature acts for the good of others by pursuing its own particular good in the context of the whole. Nevertheless, it is decisive for the Stoics that when human beings reach the age of reason, rational reflexivity can supervene on natural self-directed impulses. Consequently, Foucault writes, the person who takes care of himself properly as a Stoic, when something appears to him, he knows what he should and should not do. He will at the same time know how to fulfill his duties as part of the human community. He will know how to fulfill the duties of father, son, husband, and citizen, precisely because he will attend to himself. It is this last clause with its precisely because that carries weight for Foucault, whereas on the Platonic model, one cares for oneself because one wishes to govern others. Here, one fulfills one's duties or observes the order of natural and acquired relationships because one wishes to take care of oneself. The self is thus at once the agent and telos of the circuit, which takes in the complex of relationships with others, only to return to the finality of the self. As Foucault writes, care of the self here in itself and as a consequence must produce or induce behaviour through which one will actually be able to take care of others. But all is lost if you begin with the care of others. So let's turn next to Marcus Aurelius, of course, a prince and therefore a figure whom we might suppose most of all would take his gubernatorial care for others as self-sufficient, not subsequent to or subordinate to his care of the self. Foucault reads Marcus's position differently. Firstly, he stresses that the meditations contain very little which attends specifically to his role as an emperor, beyond the famous imperative not to Caesarize himself, which he took from his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius. Secondly, basing himself on the morning premeditation of Meditations 5.1, Foucault maintains that for Marcus, his functions and responsibilities as the emperor are not qualitatively different from those of other, less specifically other-directed occupations like being a dancer or engraver. They are more important, yes, but they are not different in kind. They are not specific, he writes. There is simply a heavy responsibility which is of the same type as any profession or trade, with merely a kind of quantitative supplement. So this desublimating reconception of sovereignty for Foucault reflects the Hellenistic-Roman care of the self. It is because the primary objective, the very end of Marcus's existence, the target to which he must always strive, is not to be an emperor, but to be himself, he writes. And it is in his care for himself, in his concern about himself, that he will encounter all his occupations as emperor, including, of course, his government of others. As a further proof text for this interpretation of the Stoic emperor, Foucault offers Meditations 8.5. Keeping your eyes fixed on your task, examine it well, and remembering that you must be an honest man, and what nature demands, perform it without a backward glance. Foucault's reading focuses primarily on the "you must be an honest man" here, suggesting that it shows definitively Marcus's ethical telos, whereas governing others is a kind of intersubjective supplement on his way back to cultivating the self. Quote, "What do you always remember? That you must be a good emperor? No. That you must save humanity? No. That you must dedicate yourself to the public good? No. You should always remember that you must be an honest man, and you should remember what nature demands. A human nature shared with no matter who must form the very foundation of his conduct as emperor, and consequently must define how he must care for himself. What is his objective? It is himself. The emperor will not only produce his own good, but also the good of others in this care of the self, in this relationship of the self to the self, as a relationship of the self striving towards itself. It is in caring for himself that he will inevitably care for others." So I underlined, I think, one of the kind of key sentences for the particular interest of this paper. So the critical questions that I want to to ask is it really right to claim, as Foucault does, that a figure like Marcus Aurelius practicing Stoic philosophy never took as his principal objective or end the public good, as against the striving towards bettering his own self? On the basis of the texts, can we justly uphold that Marcus or Epictetus would have acceded to the Foucauldian claim that all is lost if one begins with actions aimed at the common good or the good of others? My argument will be that I don't think these claims are defensible. It's notable that whilst Foucault in the Hermeneutics of the Subject cites Hadot's 1973 text on Marcus Aurelius's physics, which was included in the volume Exercices Spirituels, he doesn't refer to the 1978 text, in English, A Key to the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the Three Philosophical Topoi, according to Epictetus, which was nevertheless published in the same volume. In this text, what would become the framework for Hadot's interpretation of the Meditations, drawn from Epictetus's discourses, especially Book 3, Chapter 2, is laid out. Hadot aligns the theoretical study of physics with what he terms the discipline of desire and aversion, the study of logic with the discipline of judgment and the monitoring of one's representations, and the study of ethics with a third discipline, that of impulses for action concerning our relations with and duties towards others, the kathekonta. On such a conception, Stoicism as a lived philosophy always involves three disciplines: the person's relations to their thoughts or representations, lived logic, their relation to their desires, fears, and affects, or pathe, lived physics, and their relations with others, lived ethics. Following well-known Stoic representations of the relations between the parts of philosophy, these dimensions are organically interconnected. Whilst dissension was possible and actual between Stoics about which parts of philosophy, physics, logic, or ethics, might best come first in a pedagogical program, all were considered equally fundamental and essential to the Stoic techne to biou. So, care of the others in this schema, as you can see, falls under the heading of lived ethics. It is based exactly in that conception of man as a communal being, which Foucault recognises at one point in Hermeneutics of the Subject, but doesn't really pursue. The notion which we find in Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, or Seneca alike, that individuals are citizens of a global city, a cosmopolis, insofar as they share the same reason or logos. Marcus expresses this commonality between human beings in bracing metaphors, as John Sellers has recently stressed. The person who acts unsociably, Marcus suggests, is like the stem that has broken off a tree, the severed limb of a communal body, or a fugitive from the law. The community of reason we share is for Marcus a bond closer than the ties of blood. Marcus repeats indeed that human beings as rational animals are made for one another as against themselves. Within us, by nature, there is an impulse, horme, to act for the sake of the common good. Quote, each being must act in conformity with its constitution. By their constitution, the other beings are made for rational beings, and rational beings are made for one another. The primary constituent in the makeup of human beings is therefore the tendency to act for the common good. So I think already from these more theoretical formulations, we can see that Foucault's claim that Marcus's Stoic self-care would only take in the care of others or action for the sake of the common good as supplementary is going to be under some pressure. In the area of action, Hadot writes, to delimit what is one's own exactly, quote, means going beyond the egoistic concern for my body and my vital breath, in order to rise up to the viewpoint of reason, which is common to all human beings. Thus, it means willing that which is beneficial to the common good. And Hadot seems, I think, to be closer to the text here. When Marcus in Book 1 lists those good things he learnt from his adoptive father, these lessons include exactly that one may very well restrict oneself to a kind of life very close to that of a private citizen, without thereby becoming base or indifferent towards devoting oneself like a sovereign to what must be done for the public good. This public good is in no way an incidental byproduct of care of the self. When he returns to the issue of the one thing needful, Marcus stresses over and over again that one must consciously act for the sake of what he calls the common good. At 433, we are told that only one thing, or one thing only, is at stake for him. And this is, quote, thought directed to justice and actions accomplished in the service of the community, not for the sake of the self, but for the sake of that community. At 9.6, what is enough for a person within the sphere of ethics is your present action as long as it is accomplished in the service of the human community. The person's reasonable nature is fulfilled. Meditations 9.6 continues, if with regard to representations, it gives its assent neither to what is false or obscure, if it has desire and aversion, only for that which depends upon us, and in the sphere of ethics, if it directs its impulses only towards those actions which serve the human community. In a further meditation, 433, considering what one must practice under the rubric of care for others, we are again told one thing only, thought devoted to justice and actions accomplished in the service of the community. At 6.7, Marcus interprets his joy as residing in passing from one action in service of the human community to another in the service of the community, adding here that all this is accomplished by remembrance of God. Again, not anything like his own self-finalizing pursuit of self-betterment. There can then, I think, be no real question of the care for the others in Marcus being an indirect side effect or means towards self-care. Marcus says, someone acting for the benefit of the human community knows that he is doing so, and he wants others to know it too. Excuse me. Whatever I do, whether alone or for some other, or with some other, Meditation 7.5 says, I must aim at a single goal, that which is essential to the human community and in accord with it. I think Marcus could hardly be clearer. With that said, Stoicism is not a philosophy of supererogatory self-sacrifice, exactly insofar as human beings share a common nature, intelligence, and impulse to act for the sake of others. Let your impulse to act and your action have as their goal the service of the human community, Meditations 9.31 states, because that for you is in conformity with nature. We don't need to deny ourselves in acting out of concern for others on a Stoic conception, just as little as a Stoic will only take care of them as a means to their own self-betterment. In Meditations 7.73 to 74, we hence read this closely reasoned argument to the conclusion that I did something in the service of the human community, therefore I have been beneficial to myself. Nobody gets tired of being benefited, Marcus starts, premise 1, but premise 2, it is beneficial to act in conformity with nature, therefore, given premise 3, our nature is social. 4, do not tire of being benefited by being beneficial to others. So I think that far from being lost if one starts with care of others for Marcus, all is lost if one focuses only on oneself and one's pleasures. Each of your actions which is not related either distantly or immediately to an end which serves the common good tears life apart and prevents it from being one. He meditates. It is a seditious act, as when within a nation someone separates his party from the concordant unity of all citizens. Okay, wow. There's the syllogism there. I've really managed to finish a little quicker than I thought I would. So I've just got some very brief, as you'll see, very brief concluding remarks, and then we can go to questions. So in the longer version of this paper, the final part takes the case that Foucault has misrepresented care for others in the Stoics as established. On the basis of these parts, you may dispute that premise. It then asks how and why he could have come to this very selective or partial reading of these texts on this subject. My contention or my argument, which I'd be terrifically interested in discussing with others here, is that Foucault's reading of Stoicism is overdetermined by his commitment to a periodization which divides all Hellenistic-Roman care of the self from Socratic, Platonic, that is classical care of the self. As Laurent Jaffreau has suggested, this commitment is problematic, this periodizing commitment is problematic for multiple reasons. First, the Stoics deemed themselves Socraticoi. They recognise no such strong periodizing distinction. Second, their position on the highest good is developed in polemical contrast with that of the Epicureans, who by contrast denied that they were Socraticoi. Finally, although I have no time to do more than make a kind of grand ambit statement here, it seems to me that Ligeti, Pardue, and Joly are right that Foucault's representation of Socratic Platonic philosophy insufficiently weighs the atopia of the figure of the philosopher and the extent to which the Socratic revaluation, the extent of the Socratic revaluation of the agonistic aestheticized values of the non-philosophical classical elites. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for this very clear and thought-provoking presentation. We do have 30 minutes for discussion, and I ask all the ones who want to intervene to raise your hands. And as yesterday, and because this is collaborative work, we will give priority to our speakers and then give the word to the other attendees. So I see that Hélder has already raised his hand, and Michael Chase and Paulo Lima. We will gather this first group of questions and then we will see. Hélder.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for this very careful consideration of how Foucault and Hadot think about the relation between the care of the self and the care of the others. I find your argument very convincing, and this is also a problem I have tried to tackle in different ways. And one thing that seems to me relevant in ancient conception of care of the self and care of the others is the ancient conception of philia, or the ancient conception of the self that I see related to each other in a certain way. Because the way the problem of care of the self and care of the others is normally formulated sees these two modalities of care as an absolute alternative. One either cares for the self or one cares for the other. At least in Foucaultian terms, it tends to be seen more as an absolute alternative. But if we consider the ancient conception of the self, it seems to be more relational self, insofar as the others are also a part of one's identity. And Gill has made very interesting works regarding the ancient conception of the self. And when we consider the ancient conception of philia, especially perfect philia in Aristotle, the presentation of the ideal city in the Republic in Book 5, if you consider that brotherhood of all citizens or the rulers as a form of philia, and if we consider the theory of oikeiosis as an appropriation of others and also as a model of philia and cosmopolitan philia, we see that philia is being understood as an expansion of the self, as an identification with others. So it's not something that can be conceived, at least in ancient virtue ethics of Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics. It's different in the Epicurus, but in ancient virtue ethics, it is conceived. Philia is conceived more not as something egoistic or altruistic, as Aldra argumented, but as something that implies identity. So one is at the same time caring for oneself and caring for the others, for one's friends. So it becomes blurry, this contrast. So I think we should understand it more as a continuum where one can be place more emphasis on the self or on operations that seem to be more directed to the self, or more emphasis to the others, but all actions in a certain way would be at the same time care for the self and care for the others, at least all philosophical actions or all actions in the life of a philosopher. Would you agree with this or find this plausible? Do you see some similarity between this and your argument, or not?
Yeah, I do, Hélder. I think I very largely agree with pretty much everything that you've said there, and particularly the idea of an expansion of the self, and I think, yeah, setting it up as a kind of hard opposition, that is care of the self versus care of the other, I think is problematic, you know, I think to the extent that we take that starting point, we commit ourselves to potentially difficult discussions that don't necessarily, I think, elucidate. And I take a reference to Chris Gill and his work on the self as very much, I think, of accord with my position. I didn't mention Gill in this paper because I was focusing on Hadot, but yeah, I mean, his conception of the objectivist participant self.
Yes.
As against what's the other one? The subjectivist. Anyway. Yeah, the participant side. There is no self that is not in participation, and that in participation for Gill is necessarily intersubjective. It can also be wider than that. It can also be environmental in his work. So I think, I thank you for your comments, and I think we're in substantial agreement.
Michael, Chase, and then Paulo Lima. We will perhaps bring these two questions together, and then Matthew, you can answer. Michael, please.
Yes, thanks. Matt, that was a fabulous presentation. I think you can probably guess that I'm in agreement with 99.9% of everything you say. And it brings to mind an impression that I had yesterday, and that Hadot sort of suggests, but doesn't come right out and say, that some of the problems with Foucault's interpretation of antiquity is that he just wasn't a very good philologist. Hadot sort of voices this criticism a couple of times. He mainly confined himself to reading the Boudet editions, didn't really go into text critical questions, wasn't really tended to rely on translations, quite frankly. And that's a problem. And I think we can see this if we look at the text that you cited from 8.5. Now, of course, you're citing from an English translation of Hadot Foucault's French translation, but I suspect that the original spoke about being an honnête homme. Where you mentioned
yeah.
He has to be an honest man. But in fact, if you look at the Greek of 8.5, it says you must be a good man. Agathon anthropon. Yes. It's not quite the same thing. And agathon, of course, has all kinds of implications that being an honest man does not. And then you go on, just after you broke up the quotation, Marcus says, do all that without turning away, ametastrepi, and as it seems most just to you, kai host de kaioteton finatai soi. So there we go, the idea of justice once again there, with its inevitable reference to relations to others. That's just what justice is, right? So I don't know. What do you think about that?
I mean, I can't comment in a large sense on Foucault's capacities as a philologist. I mean, I think he was evidently such a gifted and fabulously talented intellectual. I find it hard to sort of consider that, these areas of omission, such as, for example, finishing the quote that you've just cited, and that's just I think one of quite a few, as choices. I think they're kind of, I think he's writing a certain kind of interpretation, and you're right that would mean that from a philological perspective that this is obviously going to be questionable, but this is why I really wrestled in the longer version of the paper. How could Foucault kind of miss all of this in Marcus Aurelius? And I mean, clearly, either he hasn't kind of read it, I think, maybe, or he's only read parts of it, and he's only been interested in parts of it. And why would that be?
Or he read it in a bad translation.
It could be, but there's just such a wealth of those fragments, and that really talk about action directed at the common good. It's not one or two, as you know. I mean, you've translated the Inner Citadel and you've worked on Marcus. It's really, it's something that if you read that text and you spend time with that text, it's sort of, it's very present, right? And he's always at himself about it. So it's a striking set of omissions that are being undertaken. So it seems to me that it's an interpretation. And this is the ambiguity I find with working with Foucault, and there are experts here who work on Foucault. On the one hand, there is the historical methodology, and we're looking at historical texts, and on the other hand, there is obviously a present focus. and he wants to construct an ethics, or he's looking for an alternative to the kinds of relations to the self that have been forged through, the relations to the apparati of power and so on and so forth that he's discussed for the previous decades. And it seems to me that the conflict between those two can lead to, it seems to me, these kind of very selective readings. So I don't know. I'm hedging Mike a little bit, but I just can't see that. I can't see that he's. I'd be loath to attribute any failure of ability to this guy. Do you know what I mean? I mean, who am I for a start? But I mean, he's a magnificent thinker. It's just that.
No question about that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Paulo Lima. Paulo, please.
Yes. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good night. Good afternoon. Yeah. Matthew, thank you very much for your interesting talk. It's very nice to meet you and hear you in person. Well, I totally agree with your claim, but let me just complicate things a little bit by just pointing to one aspect that seems to be important. I think much of the issue depends on the very status of the meditations, right? What kind of writing is this that Marx left us? And if we look at the text and read the text, we see that it has an exhortative character, right? It's full of imperatives in the second person. So you should remember, etc., etc. So who is this you that he's addressing? Is this you Marcus himself or the other? So and if we or both even, but if we interpret it strictly, in the case it is Marcus himself, what he says about the common good may be a way of trying to convince himself or train himself in order to be able to take care of the common good. On the other hand, if we take this second person as the other, I think we can find this relation between the self and the other in the very exhortative character of the text. So I would like to hear you about this point. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I've always read the text. I mean, influenced, of course, by Hadot and the history of the manuscript, which you'll be aware of. You know, that I think in the first instance, the second person is very much himself. So I mean, that's always, and the exhortation is therefore directed at himself. So I think that you're right to suggest that he's trying to train himself to as you say, to take care of the common good. But by the same token, I mean, I guess, I mean, if the argument that I'm developing holds, then you know, there's what is the Stoic self, you know, and what is the Stoic you, and certainly as someone like Chris Gill will emphasize, there's a you know, not impersonal dimension, but there's a sense in which it's not a kind of particular, unique, singular individual whose singularity and individuality is specific and important in any larger sense. Marcus is one rational being in a community of rational beings in a rational cosmos who has a small part of the logos within himself. So in a sense, I think that would mean that, I mean, the text, having been discovered by others, can be read by each of us, and that you can then become each of us. And so that's how I think I'd respond to what you said.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Federico Testa.
Hi, Matt. It's great to see you. First of all, thanks for the great presentation. Very rigorous and very convincing. I don't have a lot to add, and since I'm sadly convinced by your arguments against Foucault in a way, but maybe I'll just like to complicate things a little bit. I agree with that critique that there is the sort of temptation of periodization in Foucault. There is a lot that's going on because he must define the sort of difference between the Platonic care of the self and the Hellenistic care of the self.
Yes, yeah.
I agree with that, and I think that's very, that's close reading, because I think there are many occurrences in the text, in the lectures, where the sort of argument that he uses to support his analysis of the care of the self in the Hellenistic and Roman periods actually refers back to concerns of the Platonic view, right? So I would say that the main concern, and he returns to that recurrently, is that of government. So he says that, he repeatedly says that governing the city, being governed and taking care of oneself constitute a sequence. And he says at some point that the care of the self should be understood within the framework of a general practice or art of government. And so I think that's how things start to get a bit more complicated there. And also, if you look at the metaphors, right, if you look at the idea of piloting, that he goes back to after having discussed the Alcibiades, and when he's discussing Marcus Aurelius, and the analogies of medicine, political government, and the government of the self, with this art of piloting, with the art of the Kybernetes, right? So there's a whole series of points where it seems that the care of the self is actually something more related to an art of government, and as such presupposes the presence of the other. So that's just the first, point of complicating the argument that I would like to throw out there. The second one is that, well, although again, I find your presentation very convincing, and I'm tempted to agree with everything you said, there are other moments, for example, where the care of the other or the presence of the other is such a constitutive part of the care of the self that I cannot even start thinking about how to take care of myself without the presence of the other, right? So the main example of that is Parisia in The Courage of the Truth, right? So I need to speak truthfully, and I need to hear the truth in order to be able to take care of myself, right? And if I want to take care of myself, I need to speak truthfully about myself, but I also need to listen the truth that the other tells me about myself, right? And that's clear in the Epicurean example that you mentioned there, also in the hermeneutics of the subject. And finally, the third point I'd like to make is maybe something more that relates more laterally or marginally to what you're saying, but Foucault makes the point of the other, let's say, as an institutional presence as well. So if we look at both the hermeneutics of the subject, where he constantly says that, the care of the self is a phenomenon of sects, it's a phenomenon of groups. You cannot think of care of the self in isolation from the groups in which they were practiced, the rivalry between groups, the agonistic relations, the way in which each group is trying to, convince and convert people against the other group. And also in that institutional sense, in the Hystersexuality 3, there is this idea that the concern for the care of the self in the Hellenistic period is connected to a sort of new complexification of political relations. So again, you cannot think of that without presupposing the other. So yeah, those are just, things that I wanted to share with you and see what you think about them. I don't think any of them really function as a counter argument to what you're saying, but yeah, just to start this discussion. Thanks again.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. No, they're all, I think, really necessary. I think counters to any kind of too simplistic treatment of this material. I mean, yeah, it's really interesting. The phrase "the care of the self" doesn't really appear. Sorry, the care of others doesn't appear too often in the hermeneutics of the subject. And governing, I think, of the self probably occurs as much or more. And it's striking to me, and I was really disappointed to miss the paper yesterday on Platonic care of the self, which I know was on the program is how political Plato is. The reading of Plato, as I see it unfolding in the hermeneutics of the subject, I think it's a different story in History of Sexuality too. I think Foucault is quite a very political reading of Plato. He's really interested in as you say, Foucault. Federico, the link between governing the city, governing the self, and care of the self, and thereby care of the other. What's interesting is how that plays out in the periodization, and there are certainly passages that suggest that Foucault thinks that sort of a kind of break between governing the city and the care of the self takes place, and that one of the interests of the Hellenistic period is precisely that distance from relations of government that enables this culture of the self, as he calls it, to unfold. In terms of the relations to the other within the context of the philosophical care of the self, it's the hazards of not reading your full paper. I specified that at the beginning of the paper, that there are these sections, there's entire chapters, right, entire lectures on relations to the other within the context of the schools, which I personally find very convincing, and I have no problem with, and there's obviously he's drawing on Moreau and Ilse Hadot and others, and I think I'm less familiar with the text on Parisia, but again, I think your comments there are spot on. One can't undertake to care for the self outside of a relationship either within a school or with a spiritual director, and obviously Lucilius and Seneca is just one of the examples. So the other as an institutional presence, I think, is very much there in the text, and I now wish I'd read that sentence, right? 2 sentences where I sort of said that this is I mean to exclude. I'm not going to consider that. I take that as established, that Foucault thinks that the care of the self will unfold in the context of pedagogical and other relations with others. It's just that I guess what becomes the relationship of that care of the self with I guess non-philosophers and people outside the school and I guess the city, as the Straussians would say. But thank you for those comments.
Okay, we have a last question by Pablo Lamberti.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Matthew, for your very interesting presentation. And it's really nice to meet you via this conference. I have a slightly more general question, perhaps, because I wonder if Foucault fails to acknowledge this social dimension of self-care and this relation to the other, because of his disregard of the universal or cosmic dimension, which Hadot emphasizes so much, and actually criticizes Foucault for not emphasizing enough. So I'm referring to this, this cosmic or universal perspective of seeing things from above. And obviously Foucault didn't find this a very interesting aspect because of the transcendent or metaphysical nature of it, which is very problematic to him, and especially from his genealogical methods. So I wonder, like, this dimension still has very important implications for self-care and transforming the self. For instance, the image of the wise sage is very important because it invokes a kind of a cosmic consciousness in the individual that enables the individual to transform himself in light of this cosmic whole, so to say. And I think this is throughout Marcus Aurelius' meditations. You will find it everywhere, but also in earlier texts from the Hellenistic period. And I wonder, what you think if this is something Foucault fails to acknowledge, and as a result, he doesn't really stress the social dimension of self-care.
Yeah, my short answer is that I'm still wrestling with the relationship between the Hadotian, I guess, critique you've described of Foucault from the perspective of this cosmic or universal perspective, which I think is there in the hermeneutics of subject, but I think again Foucault hesitates about it. I think that he is uncomfortable with it, as you point out, and this relation to the other, and whether one is prior to the other, and if so, in what sense. The way you phrase your question, for example, I think you're suggesting that in a sense one needs to go through the cosmic or universal perhaps to open up to the other, and I find that extremely interesting. And you know, the relationship between the two dimensions in Hadot, for example, I think is also something that I'm not quite clear on, you know, because I think there is this great emphasis, I think, in a lot of literature on the cosmic and universal perspective in Hadot, and I know Mike's going to be talking about this as well. And it's such a striking dimension of his work, and it's so, I think, original. Well, not original; it's ancient, but it's so different from a lot of other contemporary philosophers. But look, I would hesitate tonight, my time, to sort of say that I think one is prior to the other. I think that Foucault is. I think if you have a look at what he says in the hermeneutics about Seneca and the view from above, I think that a similar. I mean, I would want to make a similar argument that Foucault at once confronts this dimension in Stoicism, and precisely because of the unease that you've described at the metaphysical level, he pulls back from being able to, I think, engage with it in the way that Hadot is much more comfortable with, you know. And it's really interesting that the Platonic, I think, figure of thought, or however you want to describe it, has such a huge role in setting up the contrast between the Hellenistic and the classical in Foucault's work. Because, you know, for Hadot, the Platonic tradition is continuous with the Hellenistic and Roman, and that I think is a really big difference between the two. You know, obviously Hadot starts with Platonic thought, Neoplatonic thought, and then goes to Stoicism, and it's never as though, I think Michael knows this material better than I did and knew Pierre, but I don't think he ever thought, wow, this is radically different. You know, there's whether I think Foucault sets it up certainly in the hermeneutics as there is this Platonic tradition, and it sets up the classical model, and then the Hellenistic epistrophe, conversion, salvation is something somehow different, whether it's not for Hadot, you know.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Could I just very briefly chime in, just a 2-second remark here?
2 seconds.
Yeah. Matt, I think you're right on there, and part of the difference, I think, is that once again, the standard tradition has it that the Hellenistic times, the polis is destroyed. There is no longer any. That's one reason why thinkers withdraw into themselves. Part of Hadot's research on philological epigraphical grounds was to show that no, that the Hellenistic polis kept on living, kept on flourishing well into the Christian epoch. So there again, philology, careful study of the background may explain the socioeconomic historical background may explain some of these differences of the paradigms that Hadot and Foucault are basing themselves on.
Okay, thank you once again, Matthew, for this beautiful presentation and the discussion.